Back to the channel. My name is Chris Morrison, and what we want to do today is continue our study of the book of Hebrews. Today, we're actually going to be in chapter 2, verses 1 down through 4. A shorter passage than we typically do because this is the first of the warning passages in Hebrew, and so there's a lot here. And also, I want to make sure that this is going to set the tone and kind of give us an idea where the other warning passages are going to end up going. So it's worth taking a little bit extra time in these. Now, I will say I do have a discussion of all 5 of the warning passages, a playlist, so I'll link that in the description below. They're a little shorter, but what I want to do is go through these 4 verses a little more carefully than in that short video. What I want to do to set that up is actually start at the end of chapter 1 and look at verse 14 just to remind you of where we are in the context. Remember, all of chapter 1 is basically about the supremacy of Christ over the angels. And this is where 14 is going to conclude that says, aren't they, referring to angels, serving spirits sent out to do service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation? Now, why is he making this point? Well, he's again reminding us that Jesus is the Son. He is the one who does the saving, and angels are, if I may put it this way, mere servants. And so therefore, Jesus is obviously much superior to them. But I think this is going to be really helpful going into the next chapter, because notice it says here that they are doing service for who? Who's those who inherit salvation? It's us. They're here to serve us. And so I think here of a sports analogy. When you have a coach, and let's take, for example, boxing. You have the fighter goes back to the corner, and what is the corner coach doing? What they're serving the fighter how? They're pepping them up, they're giving them strategy, they're taking care of wounds, and they do this to encourage them to stay in the fight and get back in there and fight the good fight. The implication of angels being servants of us is that they are here to encourage us to fight the good fight. And I think that is actually what we see the author of Hebrews getting to right here in our immediate context here, chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 in this first warning passage. So having thought then all about the supremacy of Christ and how his word is superior in every way to the angels, and they're here to encourage us, then the author begins, therefore. Now, you know the old joke, and we're going to say it again here. Whenever you see therefore, ask what it's there for. This is linking all of chapter 1 with what we're beginning with in chapter 2. This could be translated for this reason. So everything we said in chapter 1, therefore, what should we do? We're going to be given an exhortation, something to do. We ought to pay greater attention to the things that were heard. Let that sit a moment. We're going to see the warning in a minute, but before you see the warning, focus on the exhortation. What we ought to do is pay greater attention to the things that we heard. So there are several things worth pointing out here. First is the actual thing we're supposed to do, which is pay greater attention. Let's just start with pay attention. Pay attention. So what does it mean to pay attention? It means to give attention to detail, to really focus on and think through what all of this implies. It also doesn't just mean think about details. It means to take care to put it into practice. Now, so what details, what practice are we doing? What are we paying attention to? The things that were heard. So what things were heard? Well, this idea of heard goes back to chapter 1, the testimony that Christ, go back to chapter 1, you can just see it. God, having spoken to the fathers in the past, has at the end of these days spoken to us by his Son. So it's the revelation that he has made to believers, the supreme revelation in Christ. So the things that we heard in Christ or through Christ, that is the gospel, who he is, and we're going to see that in the next verse, that's what we ought to pay greater attention to. So you say, well, how much attention should I pay to Jesus, to the gospel? And the answer is greater. Simply, it's just greater. However much attention you're paying to Jesus, that you're paying to the gospel, pay more attention. You can never pay enough attention to Jesus. He's the most important thing there is in salvation, the most important thing, and the way God thinks about the world, that's the most important thing. And you will find is the more attention you pay to the things of God, the more you will come to discover that there is to learn about the things of God. So however much you pay greater attention. So it's always going to be a call to growth. I should, however, note that it's not simply greater in terms of how much we pay attention here, but there also does seem to be an idea of, since we have paid attention to what angels have said in the past, we should pay even more attention to what it is that Jesus has had to say. So again, so here's your exhortation. Whatever you have heard from anybody else, take what Jesus has said and pay the most attention to it. That is the most important thing. And then we have this warning, lest perhaps we drift away. Now, several things again to note in this. If we don't do this, if we don't pay attention to, if we don't take care to pay attention to Jesus's message, then there's this real possibility that we drift away. So let's start with what it means to drift away. This word actually is a fantastic translation. It has the idea of a boat that's anchored, getting pulled away by the waves. So it's just being dragged along because the anchor is not hard enough. It doesn't happen all at once. It's not just being pulled out to sea. It's drifting slowly. The same word is used in the Old Testament in one particular example. This is Proverbs chapter 3, verse 21. My son, let them not depart from your eyes. Keep sound wisdom and discretion. And so again, this is the ideas of God. The idea is keep focused on the things that God. This notion of departing is this idea in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of Proverbs. Is the idea is pay close attention, because otherwise you can lose your attention slowly over time. You were focused on this, and your mind can kind of start to wander, and if you do, then there's implications. And so the other thing worth pointing out is this drifting away that can happen if we don't pay great attention, if we're not intentional about this, is who are we talking about? And I think the word we is very important here. One of the big questions in Hebrews is the author of Hebrews speaking to genuine Christians or just professing Christians? And I think this word we speaks an awful lot of attention, awful strongly the fact that there seems to be real Christians. The author does not here say that you should pay greater attention or else you might drift away. As if you had been told the gospel, you said you believed, you really didn't, so pay great attention. So you don't, what it had, he says here that he's including himself. The author says, I myself need to pay greater attention to what Jesus has said, because if I myself, I'm a part of the were to quit paying attention, then I myself could find myself losing touch with it over time, slowly, and so until eventually I am lost at sea, so to speak. So I really think that we have this idea here of believers who have they've come to believe the gospel. What are they drifting away from? That which they've heard. They've believed it, it seems, hence the we. And if they don't pay attention to it, then there's this risk of drifting away. So this is, I think, going to be setting the stage for everything that's going to come in the rest of the book. As important as what Angel said is, we need to pay more attention to Jesus, and you have to be intentional about paying greater attention to it, because there is always the risk of drifting away. Now, why does he say this? For if the word spoken through angels, so this gets us back to chapter 1, as important as angels were, if the word spoken through angels proved steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received a just penalty. What's he talking about? Well, talk about the Mosaic covenant, which was given as, again, that whole chapter 1 about how when the angels, God spoke to the fathers in the Old Testament through angels and through visions, all that sort of thing. And so the visions came true, and the prophecies were given, and the Old Testament law was given. In other words, if God, so the word angel, by the way, if you don't know, actually means a messenger. And so these are God's messengers. And so if the messengers of God their word turned out true. So true that if you neglected it, if you ignored it, if you transgressed it, then you received a just penalty. It doesn't tell us in the context what, in this particular text, what the just penalty is. I think you're expected to know, and I think, frankly, it's just any of the penalties in the Old Testament. There's many, many, many of them. They could be as simple as being separated from the people to as far as death. And so the point is, if you transgress, then there was a penalty involved. Then we have this: how will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? Again, few things to tie into here. Going back to the part about the angels, their word was certain and secure, and the penalty followed. And yet here, who is this salvation, this great salvation? Who is it preached by? Who does it come from? Obviously, it's preached from Jesus, who is superior in every way. So if God was serious about taking serious his message through angels, how much more serious is he not going to be about the message that he gives through his son? He calls it a great salvation. Now, that other thing is the word is neglect. This, I think, ties really well with the notion of paying attention versus drifting away. This word neglect, it means to the idea of not taking seriously. It doesn't mean abandon wholesale. So far, we're not talking here about someone who just walks away from the faith and has committed apostasy outright. The idea is not taking it seriously enough. It's the idea of, I'll get to my Bible later. I'll get to my prayer later. I'll get to the gathering of the body of believers later. That all can happen, but it'll get to it in its due time. What the author is saying is, no, you have a choice. You can neglect, or you can be inattentive to what it is that Jesus has done for you. If you're attentive, then you can stay where you need to be in the faith and ultimately mature and bear fruit, as we'll see in the rest of the chapter. And if you don't, then you run the risk of drifting away and then receiving not only a just penalty from this perspective, but a severe penalty. Well, what is that severe penalty? This text does not say. So many people will take this penalty to be eternal hell. Let me just simply say that if you think that it's hell in this passage, you have to get that from somewhere else, because this passage doesn't say it. It simply says that there is a risk of some sort of penalty. Now, he goes back to finish this up. We neglect so great salvation, which at first, having been spoken through the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard. So again, this salvation was spoken through the Lord. That's Jesus. That's what we're saying. That's that. He's comparing the testimony of angels versus the testimony of Jesus himself, the Son. And then, if Jesus's testimony was not enough, it was confirmed to us by those who heard. Well, those who heard? That's the apostles. That's the initial 12. That's the initial disciples. So they heard. And how did they hear? God also testifying with them, that is the apostles. How? By signs and by wonders. And so here you're reading the Gospels, you're reading the book of Acts, you're reading all the things that God did through him to validate his testimony through the disciples, which ultimately comes through Jesus Christ, by various works of power, by gifts of the Holy Spirit, according to, now this is important, his own will. In other words, all that God was doing through the disciples, through the apostles, to establish his testimony, he was doing because he wanted to do it that way. All that stuff is about God validating his own testimony first through his son Jesus, and then validating that the apostles and the disciples had in fact the testimony of Jesus. All that was about validating their witness. And so, given the fact that God himself has testified that their testimony is true, which we can see, then we go back to the threat. How would we, if we were to neglect, not simply at this point walk away, if we were so much as neglect this great salvation, then I might say we're kind of in trouble. The point here in this passage is not merely to not walk away from the faith. The point is much more serious. The point is to actually take your faith very seriously. If you just were to take your faith seriously, everything else in the rest of this book takes care of itself. All the apostasy we're going to mention, all the difficulties we're going to face, the immaturity, all those sorts of things, none of them will come up if you just at the very beginning take your faith very, very seriously. I'll close on I think a simple illustration. If I were to say I wanted to be a really healthy kind of guy, and I wanted to take care of myself, but I never dieted, I never exercised. Instead, I drank nothing but soda and I drank nothing but candy all day. I neglected my diet. What would happen to my physical health? It would, of course, fall apart. And it wouldn't matter how many times I went to the doctor. It wouldn't matter how much medication I'm on. If I neglect the basic essentials, if I don't exercise, if I don't eat right, my body will fall apart. And I think at this point, we're very foundational stuff. The key foundational idea is God has testified. And yes, he's testified in the past through really important angels, and those were true words and prophets. But now he's given us the testimony of Jesus Christ, which we have further received through the disciples, the apostles, the New Testament, the scriptures itself. And he's validated by this, by his own working out to prove that his testimony was true. So the point here is before we get to any of that advanced stuff, we need to take seriously every single day what it is God has done, is doing in and through us. That salvation we need to pay close attention to. If we don't, there will be a penalty. Once again, we haven't addressed in this passage yet what that penalty will be, and we don't need to. We're not in there that far yet, but it's simply, I think we should recognize this is a real warning for true believers. Take seriously what God has done through you, because he certainly takes it very seriously. The death, burial, and resurrection were a really, really big deal. So thank you for joining me for this study of the first warning passage, Hebrews chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. Next video will come back. We'll do 5 and a few more verses down. Check out the linking in the description below for a shorter take on this problem passage. You want to see, go ahead and get a take on the other 4 passages. Check out that playlist too. And until I see you next time, may you be richly blessed.